Hi there. Welcome back to another video about the Edun cartridge for the Commodore 64, 128, Ultimate 64, soon to be Mega 65, etc. We're doing something totally different today. Usually when I put together these videos, I'm demonstrating the Edun cartridge running on a Commodore computer and showing you whatever the newest software features are. Right now, it's been a while since the last video, and there's been a lot of new features added to Edun, a lot of new software features. And it struck me as, before I can really go through those in any detail, I kind of need to talk about the state of Edun hardware, and in particular, the different Raspberry Pis that you can use with Edun, and what you might want to choose and why you want them, what you might want to consider when making your choices. So just as way of brief kickoff here, if you haven't seen it before, this is a naked Edun cartridge without a Raspberry Pi attached. And there's basically about 4 sections to it. You've got a bus interface portion here on the bottom. You got your microcontroller. You got your GPIO interface where the Raspberry Pi connects. You got your switches and buttons for controlling things. And you've got this analog audio section up here at the top. It's just got some passives and a headphone jack. That's all there is to it. It's a pretty simple piece of hardware. That's why I sell it as a kit. I encourage people to buy it as a kit. It's very easy to solder it together yourself, all through hole components. You don't need much fancy equipment or really great soldering skills. So the way this is usually done is you would mate the Edun cartridge with the Raspberry Pi 02. So the Raspberry Pi 02 is a good fit in every respect because it's a low-end Raspberry Pi. It's very inexpensive when you can find them in stock. The retail price is $15. So it's a great complement to Edun. It's got all the power you need to run most anything you would want to run. However, if you have aspirations of running 3D games or browsers on your Edun cartridge, that's quite possible, but that's where you would go beyond the Raspberry Pi 02. So I'll talk more about that as we go through this. But just so you see how it fits together, basically the Raspberry Pi with the SD card has all your software on it, all your data files, all your Commodore programs, games, whatever. And you simply install it kind of upside down on the Edun cartridge. And then you have this nice, clean, pretty small package with switches and buttons on the left side, and all your ports are on the top here. And so what do you have for ports? Well, you got the headphone jack, which I already mentioned, totally optional to use that. You've got a HDMI port, also totally optional, but becoming more useful by the day right now. And you've got 2 mini USB ports. This one is strictly for power, and this one is a USB on the go port. So it can be a connection to a hub, and it can also supply power. So it'll fit in a slightly modified standard cartridge case or a custom-made case. So if you put it in a case that looks real pretty like this, you got access to all the ports there. You got your button and switch on the side, headphone jacks available, and it looks real good and fits securely in your machine. And it's a great solution. But you're going to be limited if you don't connect any other peripherals. You're going to be limited to Wi-Fi for the networking, and you're going to be limited in that you don't have any standard USB ports to plug in whatever you might want to plug in. It can be thumb drives, it can be mouse, it can be external additional keyboard, anything you would normally plug into USB hub on your desktop. So with that consideration, another thing that I've used myself a lot and would recommend to people is this kind of device. This is basically a USB on-the-go hub with wired Ethernet. So this is compatible with lots of devices that have USB on-the-go ports. You can find them on Amazon. They're very inexpensive. And it's plug and play, basically. So make sure you get one that says it's compatible with Raspberry Pis. But once you power this thing up externally and you plug in to the USB on the go port like so, And now you've got your 3-port USB hub, so you can plug in all those different devices I was talking about. And you've got wired Ethernet, which is also, plug and play and lower latency. And, if you've got wired Ethernet cable sitting at wherever you're going to set up your Commodore, then it's a really nice option. If you're going to be Wi-Fi only, then, you might not use this, but still having the USB port and a convenient way to power, hub and power in one unit is pretty nice. So I do recommend these things. Like I said, you can find them most anywhere, Amazon, Alibaba, wherever you like to do your online shopping. So another option that's very similar, this was discovered by a user on the Discord channel recently, and he mentioned it, and I decided to get one and try it out. And this is pretty cool because it basically gives you the same thing as that external plastic USB hub, but in a compact package that can mate directly with the cartridge. So just like before, so that, it's basically sandwiched together. This blue board is the accessory you would buy, again, Amazon, Alibaba, whatever, and it connects basically just using these hold down screws and bolts, and uses these pogo pins to connect to contacts on the Raspberry Pi. So it's really exactly like plugging into the USB on the Go port, but without any cable required. So it's a pretty slick idea. Again, you just connect it like so. And now you can stick it in the back of your Commodore, and now you've got, an array of USB ports. You got your wired Ethernet, all the same ports on the Pi 02, and all pretty convenient to access. And it gets a little bit heavier. So, a lot of times if all you've got is the cartridge with a Pi 02, you can kind of just stick it naked into the back of your Commodore, and it's fine. It's not putting much stress on the connector. You start adding stuff like this, or you start adding bigger Raspberry Pis like I'm going to talk about, then you really need something to support it. So you either need to use standoffs, which I provide little plastic standoffs that just, sit underneath the board and prop it up so it's level with the expansion slot on your Commodore, or get a case or 3D print a case or buy a case online like the one I showed before, and you'll be happy with that. I think the case I just showed you, I haven't tried it personally, but I believe it would work just fine with this, because that top cover, this part, this is the third piece, so you can most likely assemble it so that your additional ports are just sticking up there, and then you can still lay this third piece on the very top, and it would, at least from a top view, it would look pretty nice and without obstructing access to any of the ports. So I think it's a really nice option, something to consider. So next thing you want to consider is, well, what if you are having a hard time finding a Pi 02? They are in short supply right now. It comes and goes in waves. They may be plentiful again by 6 months from now or next year, or they may be even harder to find, or you might really struggle to find them at the $15 price point, which means, well, if you're going to spend more money, maybe you ought to be looking at higher end Raspberry Pi. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is this guy. So this is a kind of a kit version of a Raspberry Pi 4. What it's made up of is it's a compute module 4 and sitting on a carrier board. So you can find these carrier boards. They're usually well stocked at different electronics outlets. Sometimes you can find them on Amazon too. The compute module 4 is an excellent device. It's a lot more powerful than the Pi 02, and especially if you're thinking about running some of the higher end, modern Linux applications that are supported by the latest version of the Edun software. Pi 04 with like 1 or 2 or 4 gigabytes of memory is a huge upgrade from the Pi 02, because it's not only more performance, but you got like multiples of the memory, right? Pi 02 only has a half a gigabyte of RAM, and it is possible to use that up running graphical Linux applications on it, and it works pretty well. But you'll find that you can run out of memory, and you can't run really demanding applications like Firefox. But with a Pi 4 class device with like 2 gigabytes of RAM or more, you can certainly do that. So I like this device because it's got everything you really need. I like that it's got a full-size HDMI port. I like that it's got wired Ethernet. It only has a single USB port, but that's fine if all you want to do is connect a mouse. If you want to connect more devices, then you just plug in a hub and go for it that way. And then it's got USB-C for power. And this one comes with a micro SD card slot, just like the other Pis, but you can also get MMC memory on the compute modules. So this particular device has 32 megabytes of MMC, so I don't bother with the SD card. I use the MMC device. It's got better performance. And so, yeah, pretty compact package and works pretty well. So for these, Model B style devices, you again just flip them upside down and connect them to your cartridge, and it doesn't look as compact or as pretty, but it's still fully functional. You can easily access the button and the switch on the side here. The ports aren't all aligned on the top. The audio port becomes a little bit harder to get to. But if you're using this class of device, you probably want to plug in HDMI anyway, and you can get your audio from the Pi off the HDMI connector. You don't have to bother with the headphone jack in that case. So that's probably a better way to go. And you can see that with this device, with no heat sinks, so you still, all the devices we've talked about so far don't require any type of cooling, passive or certainly not active. This device I've had, I've run it for powered up for weeks, even months at a time with no heat sinks or anything. But you can see it's right buttoned up against the like these capacitors here. It just barely kind of fits, but it does fit. And so, yeah, Pi 4 is a good option. If you happen to have a Pi 3B or 3B Plus, those are also pretty good. I mean, they're roughly the same CPU as the Pi 02, but the good thing is they can come with a gigabyte of RAM. So again, a gigabyte instead of half a gigabyte gives you a lot of headroom to run more or bigger applications on the Raspberry Pi, on the Linux side of things. So let's finally talk about the Raspberry Pi 5. So I'm going to bring in a different cartridge here this time. And so here's a Raspberry Pi 5, and it's unique in a couple of respects. First of all, it's by far the most powerful Raspberry Pi. So if you've got aspirations of running, all kinds of things, maybe doing some like AI agents or certainly browsers, 3D games, emulation, all this kind of stuff. If you think you want to run that from your Commodore through the Edun cartridge, Raspberry Pi 5 is going to provide the most headroom and the most, longevity, performance, memory, better GPU, all of that. The issue with the Pi 5 is, first of all, it wasn't supported for Edun until just recently, but with version 1.3, I changed to a 64-bit Linux. Actually changed from upstream, it used to be Arch Linux 32-bit was the upstream Linux, and now it's 64-bit Alpine Linux is the upstream. So the custom Linux OS for Edun is built on top of 64-bit Alpine Linux, which means you can use a Raspberry Pi 5 now. It requires a 64-bit operating system. So it is supported, but there's caveats. And the biggest caveat is mechanical compatibility. And the reason is you got to have some type of at least passive cooling with the Pi 5. So what I've got here is, this is like the bare bones minimum. I've got a couple of passive heat sinks that are just the right size, do not interfere with anything, and just big enough to provide sufficient cooling that I can run it reliably and it won't get too hot or shut down on me unless I really push it. If I push it hard enough, I can get it to the point where it will throttle and eventually it can shut down. But this is serviceable. It works pretty well. What it really wants is active cooling. I mean, that's the recommendation for Raspberry Pi 5 is a heat sink much bigger than these, covering more of the chips and with a fan too. So you get all the noise and etc. from the fan, but it keeps it nice and cool, and you don't have to worry about any throttling or shutting down. With this, you do have to be concerned. And for Edun cartridge, even with just adding these small heat sinks, you got to make some modifications. So you can see on this particular cartridge, I've removed the audio headphone jack. I removed the other analog audio associated components that would have been in the way, which is these 4 capacitors here that would stick up and interfere with the heat sinks. But with that stuff removed, everything's still fully functional. You use your HDMI port to get your video and audio output, so you're not going to miss the headphone jack at all. And you just install it the same way as before. Like so. And just like with the Pi 4, you've got all your critical ports here on the right side. You can still access the button and the switch, and then you've got access to your USB-C power, and it's got 2 micro HDMI ports for the output. So this is the high end now. It's definitely got some caveats, but it does work. Another solution besides doing what I've done here and putting on passive cooling and removing the components that are in the way on the cartridge is you could cable it. So you can buy a short, like a 6-inch GPIO to GPIO cable and use that to just connect to a naked Edun cartridge, and then the other side to the GPIO on the Raspberry Pi. Of course, you got to make sure you get the orientation correct. But if you do that, you might be able to have a nice Raspberry Pi 5 case. You might be able to take advantage of the PCI Express connector on the Raspberry 5 to connect up like some faster NVMe style flash storage instead of using micro SD cards. And they're pretty fast on the Raspberry Pi 5, but NVMe is considerably faster. So then you could have a nice, pretty external unit just cabled to your Edun cartridge. And so why would you want to do that? Again, the Raspberry Pi 5 will be overkill for most people using Edun. Most people are going to be perfectly happy with a Pi 02 or maybe a 3 with a gigabyte of memory, or a 4 you can push it a little bit farther, have more headroom. The Raspberry Pi 5 is really if you want to run Amiga emulation, 3D games, the big, large, modern applications like Firefox, and you want to have plenty of headroom to open up, multiple tabs, then sure, yeah, a 4 gigabyte or even an 8 gigabyte Pi 5 is going to be the way to go for that. So those are the basic options. I will say what's excluded from this party is one thing that's excluded is the original Pi 0. Those have been out of manufacturing for I think over a year now. And the issue there is it's an older ARM CPU, and it cannot run this 64-bit OS that Edun is on now. Similar problem with the original Pi 2B. The later Pi 2Bs are ARM64 capable, so they could be used, but they're not very fast, and they've only got I think half a gig of RAM. So you're better off with a Pi 02 than a Pi 2. So really the sweet spot's going to be the Pi 3, 4, or 5. And really out of all those, if you're not going to use a Pi 02 because you want more capability, or you can't get your hands on one, then I'd really recommend the Pi 4 or the Pi 5 if you want something that's going to be good for years to come and let you do all the things that we might think of doing with the Edun cartridge as time goes on. So hopefully that's a sufficient update. Feel free to comment down below any experience you have with the Edun cartridge or with Raspberry Pis or with finding Raspberry Pis, and what you think of these various solutions. Obviously, this is just scratching the surface. There's lots of ways you can set things up, and you should explore. And if you find anything that's useful to the community, please consider joining the Discord and talking about it there. Also, there's links in the description for ordering Edun cartridges off of Tindy, or for visiting the GitHub site where the open source software for Edun is available, or for looking at the docs. Oh, and there's one more kind of bonus thing I'll mention too. If you don't have an Edun cartridge, but you do have a Raspberry Pi, and even if your Raspberry Pi maybe looks something like this, you can still kind of at least get started and play along, because the Vice emulator for Edun allows you to basically run everything from the Raspberry Pi. So if you have a high-end Pi like a 5, or this is a Pi 400, which is a pretty high-end device. This one's got 4 gig of RAM, lots of ports, lots of capability. Not a great keyboard, but the new, I think, Pi 500 Plus has a fantastic keyboard. And basically you just load the same SD card image on this, and you run Vice, and Vice emulates the connectivity between the Commodore and the Edun cartridge, or Edun Vice, the device that's customized for Edun, emulates that connectivity. So you can run all the same software, all self-contained within the Pi, which is great for experimentation or development, or just dipping your toe into Edun while you're biding your time to solder together a cartridge on some Saturday afternoon. So I did want to mention that too. Edun Vice doesn't just run on Raspberry Pis, it also runs on Windows or Mac or Linux desktops, wherever you want to run it. And if you run it on a desktop, it can connect to your Edun cartridge across your local area network. But you don't have to use a network. You can just run everything self-contained inside a sufficiently powerful Pi as well. So I think that's enough for now, and I think that sets the stage for talking about some of the new features that are coming out just now for Edun, and why you might want some of these higher end Raspberry Pis in the future. So thanks for watching, and take care.